you know, it maybe looks a little bit dirty. There's probably some things you can do. At the time though, I wasn't really sure. So what I did is I just dragged over this area. I brought it into the image. See, it's just gonna, very high resolution reference, guys. You know, it's super high res. Here's at 100%. You really get to see all of the subtleties. You get to see the pulp on the inside, things like that. When you're working in the print industry, you've got to consider them. And I know guys out there that would very much consider scattering things like the pulp to go next level. Okay, straight away you can see that the color's not right, but the first thing I'm going to do is just kind of decrease the opacity up the top here, and then I'm going to scale it to fit the glass. Because the shape of the glass is a little bit wrong, I can use Control T to deform, and if I hold down Control and move each point, I can kind of localize that movement. If I don't have Control selected, I can only scale. So I'm just going to move this in here. Now, of course, this liquid is actually overlapping. So I've got to consider that and stretch it out to the point where it's overlapping, and then I'll create a mask from behind. Just stretch this side out. Next up, I'm going to put it on linear dodge, just to see kind of where things are overlapping. Now I can go back, and I'm just going to, before I do that, one of the things that you've got to really factor in when retouching is depth of field and the masks you're applying. So in the feather here, pay attention, I'm just going to go up to 4 pixels. When I select this now on the edge, you'll see that it's actually a little bit too far. Maybe even I can just go 2 pixels. You can see it's got a slightly rounded edge. Now when I have removed that section, it's not so perfectly, you know, it's not razor sharp pixel edge. I'm just going to select slightly over a bit. I don't want to leave any of the white there. Now you can see we have a little bit of a better transition. And I can just pull this out like so. Now I'm going to use the eraser tool. And I'm not even using a Wacom here. You could definitely if you wanted to. I'm just painting away. Actually, and sometimes if it's quick, you can just use the eraser tool or apply a mask and then just paint it there. Obviously it's non-destructive then, you can go back and undo things, but that's the type of stuff you do when you're lazy and you're just trying to bash through it quickly. So one of the easiest ways to do this is I can paint over the top and go beyond where I want to paint and then hit X. Now I've inverted the mask brush here, so now I'm painting it back in, and I can just zoom in like so and just start painting away. Now I'm going to go back and just kind of start adjusting the opacity of this slime. Now this isn't working yet because the color's completely off, so from here in the experimental phase I might collapse this at the end. I'm going to put a hue and saturation over the top and then hit Ctrl-Alt-G to link that to the layer below. Now I can go in and play with the hue and saturation, get maybe some of that green coming through. Just a little bit saturated. I might play with the opacity, how this is sitting over. So that was one of the first things I did, just seeing if I could make the liquid a little bit more realistic. Now of course, when you're experimenting with this stuff, you're going to fail a couple of times, and that's where just kind of experimenting with different parts, you know, you just use the same process I just used. Maybe the lighting here didn't necessarily work. I've gone and shot a couple of different types of reference. Let me just bring in just another shot. You can see this time it's very much top lit. So let's just say I bring that in. I'm going to increase the hue and saturation. And I'll just get rid of these two. I'm going to set this to linear dodge. and I'm going to adjust the hue and saturation. Play with some different blend modes. In 32-bit, it's a little bit tricky. Just going to make a mask around the edge here, get rid of this. Just quickly warp it into place. Make another mask. You can see I'm using just the same method here. Maybe adjust the opacity a little. See, once again, that doesn't work. It's all good. Delete the layer. If I turn on the layer I did use, and make this normal, you can see I've stolen part of the image here, but instead of stealing the one that looks like this, I actually ended up using this pass here. You can see the highlight down the bottom here. I've faded that away a little bit. And I realized once I couldn't get the liquid looking better than the raw render, maybe I could just bring out a little bit of a glow inside of the material. So I put it on linear dodge. You can see what that does. It just gives the liquid a little bit more of a luminescent look and feel. You can see that this liquid here, even though it's kind of luminescent, it's not as luminescent, and I just wanted to separate the two so they didn't look like the exact same material with slightly different colors. And I was pretty happy with it. I thought that did make it look a little bit more realistic. Alright, next up, let's move over to the left here. I had a major issue looking at the grapes inside of the beaker on the left. I just didn't think it looked very real. So what I did is I went back inside and started experimenting utilizing the scatter volume shader, because what I was using here was the SS2 shader, and I honestly just feel like when you use the scatter volume shader correctly, it always gives a slightly more realistic look because you've got greater control over the reflections of the grapes themselves. So now you see the major difference here in the reflective quality of the grapes as well as the SSS. Instantly looks more realistic. Now another thing you'll notice here is in this pass that I've rendered off, a lot of the lights are in the exact same position. Just pay attention up here. A lot of those are in the exact same position. The front light's in the same position. The difference though is we've got a new light on the front edge, and I just thought that could be cool to introduce. So what I did to make this pass was go back into Photoshop, obviously reapplied and readjusted the materials on the grapes. But one of the issues is that I didn't want to have to re-render the whole scene because it just took a long time to calculate. So I always go in when I'm rendering these smaller areas and try and factor in what I can remove from the scene that's not necessarily going to affect the object itself. So I removed the water jug here. Now the light source you're seeing here, which is kind of blocking the reflection on the beaker, when you take that water jug away, I moved this light source and the light a little bit closer into the table so that I did get that nice reflection on the front, which just brought out a little bit more shape. When I saved off that file, I just thought that the new shader looked a little bit darker. So let me just, you can see even though the glass is the same everywhere, by making the material darker, it just gave the appearance that the beaker itself was darker, and I wanted to correct that, so I went in and applied an exposure adjustment. You can see I've lifted it basically one stop here. and I've linked that just to the layer below using Ctrl-Alt-G. Now you can see by doing that, I think we get a more even blend of the lighting in the scene. Now, like I've said a million times, when you're doing these things piece by piece, you're doing it so that you get every area of the image equally as refined. With that, when you're doing new shaders, when you're doing new lighting, you've got to factor in the overall brightness, because if one thing's really dark and another thing's really bright, your eye is going to pick up on that subconsciously and you're going to realize that it's a mistake. So try and balance things out. In order to bring out a little bit more of the detail in the liquid below, you can see it's a little bit dark. I just duplicated up this layer and put it on linear dodge. I blurred it just a little bit, and you can see it just brings out a bit more shape. If I zoom out here, let me just go full screen. You know, I really wanted sometimes in V-Ray when you have refractions under the water, it can be a little bit darker than you expect. So for example, we've got a lot of nice light up on the top of the grapes here, but then underneath the water, it's really dim and foggy. It does look cool, but by bringing out some of the detail there, it just looks a little bit better. Pay attention though, because you can see that my masks are a little bit messy here. You know, you can do things like, subtle things like that. Let me just zoom really far in. See little lines like this? This is the type of stuff that a professional retoucher will fix. Alright, moving forward here, I'll just try and run through this stuff quickly because you're not going to have these issues when you render the beauty pass that I'm providing for you. But when I made the when I made the grapes, the default kind of red shader here, obviously it's going to affect the refractions and things like that. So I just had to go in and kind of fix these areas one by one. So you can see I've just gone in, rendered a region with the correct shader. I've done it for all of the grapes in the scene. You can see I've just re-rendered them with the correct scatter volume shader. Down the bottom here, all the grapes are fixed. Really subtle stuff now. Try not to pay too much attention and overanalyze things, because sometimes when you're doing stuff, you're just doing it in the moment and it just happens. But one thing I noticed is when I rendered the new grapes for the refractive area behind, it was noiseless, but the glass in the previous render had a little bit of noise in it, and I thought that gave the glass a dusty appearance, so the noise was actually beneficial. So in getting rid of it, it made the scene look a little bit too clean here. So I just duplicated an area of the glass so that there was a bit of noise, and it just damaged the pixels in that area a bit more. Now next up, to do the grapes like this, I wanted to once again simplify the lighting in the scene. When I rendered the grapes with this shader, with the lighting I used for the overall scene, everything was just a little bit too bright. You know, I lost some definition in the grapes because the light was coming from all angles, so I just wanted that directionality from top to bottom. Now you can see in the reflections here, we've got the two hero lights, and all the other subtle lights have disappeared. That's because to do the grapes, I went in and I disabled some of these additional lights just to kind of keep it simple. And when I was doing that, I once again relied on the reference that I shot. Let me just bring that up for you. You can see that top-down lighting. You get the nice speckly highlight. This reference is perfect for trying to match this stuff. You can see we get some subtle variations. And then on top of that, because the reference here is so high res, we can even see the fur fibers, maybe some subtle variations in the reflection glossiness that you wouldn't pick up on if the reference wasn't as high res and clear. Get that nice kind of gradient coming through from dark red to that weird pinkish red, and then it goes orangey. So I'll just cancel that. And then I tried to emulate that in the grapes themselves. And by putting the fur over the top of the grapes, you can't, oh yeah, you can see that. You can see I've got a V-Ray fur modifier on them. It just gives them a bit of a fuzzy feel, makes them look a little bit more realistic. In the process, when I rendered them, I forgot that I disabled some of the grapes in the scene. You can see that they're kind of disappeared here. It was just a chunk of the model at the top. I think they're actually disappeared here as well. They are. So I just had to re-render them. So it's just a small region render. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, when you go in and make color adjustments in Photoshop, you never just do it and settle on it. There's always a process of doing it, tweaking it, making other color adjustments over the top to balance things out. And in that respect, retouching can be a little bit complicated to explain in an exact manner. But what I did next was put a sepia adjustment over the top. Now, the reason I did that is because when you're retouching a file like this that's quite detailed, it needs a little bit of work. I might have been staring at this for an hour at this point. Now when you look at an image like this, you'll see that it's very blue in the highlights, in the glass. It doesn't have very much orange in the scene. Now I wanted to kind of correct that. Now I overdid it here. This sepia adjustment is just a little bit too powerful. So if I go all the way up the top here, you can see I've got another photo filter that I adjusted maybe 5 minutes after I'd gone in and made some layers in between, because I realized it was a bit too orange looking at it like this. So I undid it and kept working. It's just something to note there. Another thing with color adjustment, like I said, you're not always going to get things locked off. So I've actually gone in and increased the saturation on the candle holder. Now I did this because I wanted to separate it off of the flower vase or the pot behind. You can see when it's the exact same material. Even though we've got some nice detail popping off, in terms of the hue and saturation, we're very similar. So I've gone in and done that, thinking that it was good, but later on in the process I do fix that also. Now if we go up further, I noticed that the leaves were just way too saturated, but I also noticed that the brightness was quite off. Now if you're used to retouching in 8-bit, when you go in and make adjustments to the hue and saturation, you'll notice that dropping the lightness up or down completely damages, and it's not very useful at all. But in 32-bit, because we've got a lot more information to work with, the hue and saturation adjustment layer is way more powerful. So I can go in, localize just the green colors, and then drop back the exposure, keeping that detail. It's still lossless, and I just thought that that could introduce a bit more realism into the leaves. So for example, let me go in here. I'll put a hue and saturation over the top. Now I don't want to adjust the master controls here. I only want to adjust the green areas. So I can go down. Now another thing is when you're trying to localize specific colors and you don't want to adjust everything else, it's very handy to go in and play with the fall off parameters down the bottom. Now you've got the tighter control and then the feather off of that. So everything inside of here will be controlled 100%, and then it fades from 100 to 0 based on the distance here. So I want to capture some of the yellow, and I want to bring it over a little bit more into the yellowy area, so I'm getting all of these green leaves, and I want to remove away from a bit of the blue. Now remember, I'm just adjusting the green channel here. Now I can slide down. See, I'm not really capturing these colors here, so I'm just going to slide this out a bit more. Now as I slide that out, you'll notice that it's picking up more of that color. I can slide it out a little bit into the red. Now as I do that, we're picking up heaps more, but we're not losing information here. Next up, I can just bring back the saturation a little bit. It's just a little bit too bright. And then lastly, I can go play with the hue. If I want the leaves to look a little bit more lively, I can make them more green, like so. If I want them to look a little bit more dead and lifeless, I can go over into the orange. I just wanted to make a very subtle adjustment here. Constantly playing with the different settings and the fall-offs. And there you go. It just kind of makes it look a little bit nicer, a little bit more realistic. But we're affecting other areas as well. So next up, what I do is I'll fill the mask for that layer, which is now white, with black. Now I only want to paint in the areas where I've got the leaves. So now I can go in, make sure that the opacity is set to 100, and just paint this in. And it's just got to be a very rough mask. Doesn't need to be perfect. And you end up with something like that. Now obviously every time I do this, it's going to be slightly different. But you can see I'm getting a very similar effect. Now I realized I'd increased the saturation on the candle holder now, but the candle itself was kind of lacking some of that really nice yellow color that you kind of associate with wax. So what I did was just made a quick hand painted mask and increased the saturation. You can see the mask is a little bit dodgy. Once again, a professional retoucher won't really make that mistake. But I've just boosted it up a bit, and I've gone a little bit over more towards the yellow side on the hue. You can see as I go, if I go plus, add all, it just makes it look a little bit too yellow. So I've just brought that over a bit more. Now pay attention when you're doing this stuff, because even though I've made mistakes like this, I'd hate to see you guys do the same. So you can just go in there and just hand paint and fix up that mask. Just a little bit nicer now. You don't want to affect the candle holder itself, because we've already boosted the saturation there. Now at this point, I'd actually forgotten to overlay the glare and bloom from the whole scene in. So that's where I kind of extracted the glare and bloom and put that over the top. Just thought it gave the image a little bit more of a surreal look, you know, like it was a bit foggy maybe, instead of perfectly clean. Next up, another very subtle adjustment. We've got the lid fix layer here. By default, you'll notice that the triplanar mapping I've applied is not blended correctly, and on the lid here we can see a very obvious seam. I've just gone in and fixed that with some clone stamping. Very simple adjustment, but that's, you know, the type of detail you need to focus on. You see that stuff, it's very obvious, it's CGI. Now next up, this is probably the most important layer in the scene, because I really felt like this adjusted the entire lighting and made it look a little bit closer to Anatoly's work. One of the coolest things about working with 32-bit is that when you multiply or set something to multiply that's exposed over 1, you're actually adding information to the scene. When it goes below 1 on the exposure, you're taking away. So a Z-depth pass that's been adjusted in 32-bit can be utilized to brighten areas closer to the camera and darken areas further away, or you can adjust the mask and really finely control where you want different areas of the scene being brighter or darker. So let me go down to the very bottom here, and I'm going to steal the Z depth pass. I'm just going to copy and paste that. Now you can see here that even though you can't see that you can't see the Z depth pass because I've got all the layers over the top, but I know if I select that and copy it, I can come back up and I'll just make a new layer here and I'll paste this over the top. Now by default, the Z depth pass you're using isn't going to work perfectly, but the goal here is to darken off the image further back. So the first thing I did, and this was just an experiment, I only found this out on this project, just playing around. I set it to multiply. Now you can see that it is making the areas behind the glass darker, but everything closer in front is also being darkened off. So the balance of this pass isn't right yet. So from there, I can put an exposure adjustment over the top and link it. Now I've got much better control over what this pass is doing. You can see that by increasing the exposure, now the front areas are going just around 1, so we're not really affecting them, but we're actually going a little bit brighter, so it's brightening areas at the front. If I increase the gamma, we're going to go darker at the back and brighter at the front. Now with that single layer, we completely change the look and feel of the scene. Now all of our attention is being placed on the hero objects because the background and everything else is much darker. You can see we're bringing in shape into the plants because the further into the plants we see, the darker they get. If I get rid of this stuff, I just thought that was so cool. I was extremely happy when I did that. I'm always looking for things like that which are replicatable on any project and are going to give you that same nice effect. So that's how I did that. Now once I was happy with where I locked off the exposure, and please remember there's no exact science to this, for each individual project you're going to need to adjust the exposure and the gamma adjustment according to whatever you're working with. But once I'd done the exposure and locked that off, I just collapsed it down and then I started painting out where I wanted that layer to affect. And now you can see I've gotten rid of it in some places. Let me go in here on the mask and I'll just set this to 100%. You can see that the plants were darkened off quite a lot. So when it's fully white in the mask there, just pay attention down here. You'll see that I've just painted away that black. Maybe you want that. I just thought it was a little bit dark, but it's an incredibly powerful tool. So I really hope you guys, at least with this specific technique, test it out for yourself on your own projects and let me know how it goes. Now you can see I've started painting some custom vignettes for the scene and really trying to enhance that effect where most of the light is centered. We're getting, we're starting to fake things a little bit now. All this layer it's just a solid color. Let me bring this up. It's just a solid color I've painted with a soft brush. You can just sample it. It's just a slight blue. It means when I multiply down here, we're incorporating just a little bit of that blue tint. You can see if I desaturate it fully, slight difference. But plants usually do have more of a greeny bluish tint to the reflections. Then I just backed off on the intensity. Obviously at 100%, it's just way too dark here. Always good to go overboard with the intensity of layers and then be able to drop back on the opacity. What that does is it gives you a little bit finer control and more importantly, easy control over how strong the effect is. If you start out at 100 and the effect isn't enough, for example, if I painted in a blue color that was a lot brighter, when I multiply that down, it's not going to be dark enough. So even at 100%, I'm not going to see the effect like I want. So I go super dark on the color. So at 100%, it's really dark, and then I can just play with the opacity. It also gives me control if I want to go in and make a mask and then further darken off some areas. Now next up, once again, I'm just doing a custom painted mask. Sorry, a custom painted layer here, exact same as below, just darkening off the right side a bit more. Now you'll see that there's some problems on the bottom right here. Now if I go all the way to the top of the layer, I've actually got crop markers that I've put in. Now I didn't do this necessarily at this point, but I was visualizing in my head that at some point I was going to need to crop in. That's why I wasn't paying too much attention to this area down the bottom here. The reason for that is because when I looked at this image, I noticed that the composition was just a little bit off center a bit, and the camera I used was pulled out more so that I could crop in and really gain control over that in post work. You'll notice I've cropped in the area exactly where this cloth isn't noticeable that it's overhanging like this. Having this angle here in terms of a compositional sense is really breaking it, and it kind of detracts away from the balance in the scene because we go from white to red and then white just in the corner. You know, it's very distracting. By cropping away from there, you can see we just go from white to red, and we simplify it, and we assume the cloth naturally hangs down like so. So at this point in the explanation, I'm about halfway through the retouching, and we've already made some massive changes just by going through one by one. Let me group this all and just show you what's happened so far. Looks completely different and a lot better already. Alright, next pass, I've gone in and re-rendered the material for the cloth and the other cloth, sorry, the red cloth, the silk. I've generated a mask for that, and now you can see that with that new layer in there, it looks way better, way more realistic. In the next part of the lesson, I'm going to be breaking down the materials for all of this. Straight away though, a much better result. But please remember, by putting this cloth over the top, effectively we've lost that effect from the Z depth pass below. You can see it's affecting everything but the cloth because I've overlaid that on the top. So I've had to go in, duplicate this layer and relink it to the cloth, and I've gone in and made some slightly different settings for this. But we get a similar effect to what we had before. You know, the cloth darkening off a little bit from behind here. Of course, I could disable that and pull that underneath, but you can see the effect is way more severe here. That's why I've gone in and adjusted the exposure settings inside of this mask, because I didn't want it to blow out and increase the brightness of the cloth at the front, because I'd specifically readjusted the lighting for this pass. So going into V-Ray, once again for the cloth, I disabled all the additional secondary lights and relied purely on these main hero lights. Now another thing I did is, let me just go in and group these two layers together. You'll notice that there's a lot less light at the front here. And more light on the top. Now I actually just boosted the intensity of the light here rather than adjusting the exposure. So when I re-brought it in, it was sitting a bit nicer compared to the adjustments I'd made up until this point. Next up, I've just got a little layer down the bottom here. Don't even think this is sitting in the right spot. It's meant to be sitting down just a bit like this, like so. You can see that there's just a slight corner here on the edge, so I've just gone in, sampled the color of the cloth down the bottom and just painted that in. Next up, I've used the shadow pass to boost the caustics down the bottom here. Just like I showed at the start, you can duplicate up the shadow pass. I've painted it away so it's only affecting just this small area. But effectively, I've brought out a bit more detail underneath here and made it look like that really intense light is spilling through the glass onto the cloth below. Next pass, you're all familiar with it. It's just a simple occlusion pass. Now let me put this on normal mode just to give you an idea of the scale. You can see I've gone quite large here. I've got heaps of detail in the scene. Now I'm not entirely sure if I made some major adjustments to this, but it's highly likely. Let me just sample here. It'll be the easiest way to tell. Nope, it's at 0 stops. So it's possible that I've just left it as is. But you can see adding that layer over the top grunges the scene down a little bit more and makes it look a bit more painted. We bring out more shape in the leaves. Let me zoom in here. You know, we get a bit more depth in the shadows, which brings out the non-shadowy areas. For example, you can see here in the flower petals, slightly dark. Now, of course, if you really wanted to be anal and make sure that things like that weren't degrading the image, I can go into the occlusion and you can see there's just a few areas I've painted away. Let me zoom in on those and just maybe figure out why I've done that. Okay, I know. I actually made an adjustment to the physical shape of the cloth, so by occluding over the top with the old geometry, it wasn't sitting right. That's why I had to go in and paint it away. You can see there's a line here that I'm getting, and by painting it away there, we don't affect and ruin the image. Next up, I've duplicated the occlusion pass. Let me set this to normal. But you can see I've gone in and adjusted the hue and saturation. The reason I've done that is because increasing the hue of the candle holder here just made things look a bit too bright and saturated. I thought it looked a bit fake, maybe a bit CGI. By incorporating a bit more of that green tint, we get a bit of that kind of oxidation. Basically, all I'm doing here is just trying to fake adjusting the material. Of course, if you had the time, you could go in and adjust the material in V-Ray and re-render it. We're getting very close now. There's not heaps more layers. Even if you're making really quick progress and it seems like a lot's happening, every 30 minutes to an hour, get up out of your chair and take a constructive look at the image without making any adjustments. And when I say step back, I literally mean step back and look at it from more than 3 or 4 feet away and just get an overall idea of what you're thinking about the scene, what things you think might need to be fixed. Analyze the image again to see if there's any errors, see if any masks you've painted were done incorrectly. Now, even though you don't see them in this final retouch file, I can promise you that throughout the process, I did have to go in and make those smaller changes. You know, I did go in and adjust exposure adjustments like on the beaker here, and then realize that there were problems and have to paint it out. So you've got to be very critical, and you've got to give yourself the chance to learn from the mistakes by taking a step back, observing it for a few minutes, and then get stuck back into it. By doing that, I effectively realized, staring at it like this for a few minutes, the next step was I realized that I'd gotten the liquid material completely wrong down the bottom. You're not going to need to worry about this because the scene file has it fixed, but you can see here I've gone in and re-rendered that material with a proper translucent, scatter volume shader, and I've also kind of adjusted the intensity of some of the lights, as well as changing the fabric. You can see it's a little bit brighter than everything else. I've made some adjustments here and then just kind of collapsed the exposure. But little things like that, if I go into the mask, I can just paint away here if I want. But then I realized that it actually kind of looks maybe like a bit of caustics or refraction bouncing onto the fabric. So I wasn't not happy with it. Now we're getting down into some of the more subtle things in the scene, like the bonus reflections. So let me turn these on. I'm just going to duplicate this layer so I'm not damaging anything here. The first bonus layer I've done, and I do provide the scene files for this, is just disabling everything in the scene and rendering it with a different HDR. Now, I played with the different HDRs inside of V-Ray until I got something that I just thought gave nice kind of aesthetically pleasing highlights. This is difficult, at this point, this is a very creative decision you're making here. And having a library of HDRs available like Jorgen's makes it a lot easier, because what I'm trying to do here is obviously stick to the realm of an indoor scene. So I'm going to use an indoor HDR, and thankfully Jorgen's, he has a very diverse range there. So I just spent, 20 to 30 minutes in V-Ray RT, going in, applying the same material to everything except the glass objects. Now, the purpose of this layer was more specifically to create some nice details in the refractions themselves, getting things like the reflections on the edge, getting things like these glows inside the water jug. Remember, this is 32-bit. I can put an exposure adjustment over the top of this and link it. You'll see that as I slide down here, this is the power. We've still retained all of the detail here. So if I go in and apply a mask to these areas, even though it's very bright by default, I can go all the way down, and you can see that we retain all of the detail. This is the power of doing everything in 32-bit. Now, of course, the most important element to consider in doing a bonus pass is where you're masking it in. I haven't applied those reflections everywhere. You can see I've strategically put them in just where they're introducing a bit of detail into the glass. I'm not overdoing it. See, I'm creating a bit of a nice highlight on the lip here. Things like that, they're just happy accidents. Bob Ross. Now from here, I've rendered out another bonus pass. Let me duplicate that up, just to demonstrate to you what it looks like without any of the mask applied. I've used the exact same scene. Now, while I set that scene up in V-Ray, I simply just let it render the previous pass, changed the HDR out until I got that looking good, and then let it re-render. This time, however, the bonus pass that I used, I wanted it to catch a bit more directionality from right to left. I wanted to create some shape on the objects that I'd created and really bring out the sculpted detail. You can see it's picking up some nice shapes on the glass. We even get a couple of nice highlights. Now, sometimes the key to these bonus passes is the simplicity. You don't want too many reflections because it can be overwhelming. These are designed just to bring out some detail that wasn't there before. So let me turn that off. Now you can see I've disabled the layer here. The areas I'm putting this stuff in, now let me put it on linear dodge. Areas I'm putting this in just bring out some additional details that weren't there. I keep reiterating that, but they're very powerful. Now you can see though that in putting this layer in, let me just show you, it even catches some refractive, liquid edges. Things like that can be useful. But on a scene this complicated, that bonus pass isn't going to work on every single material, because some materials are going to have varied reflection colors, or they're going to have brighter or darker reflections depending on what the material is like. So for example, on the silver here, this can be really useful. I can bring out some details here and it just works out of the box, just catching some nice edges. However, on a material like gold, of course, gold has a gold reflection color. So you've got to factor that in. And that's why the layers I've got over the top here, these 4 layers, I linked to that layer itself. So these next 4 layers are all linked and adjusting this one single bonus layer. Now let me just run through those. The first, I've brightened up the exposure of some areas like the liquid, just to bring out some of the shape there. See, if I didn't do that, that pass basically has no effect. It's not noticeable to the naked eye. But by boosting that exposure and increasing it 5 stops, very bright adjustment, we pop it all and it looks better. Next up, I've masked off where I want the reflection color to change, and this is a hue and saturation adjustment. You can see I've brought it all the way into the yellow area here. Now when you've got a perfectly white material and you set things to color in Photoshop, wherever you put it on the hue slider is obviously the color it's going to be. Just something to note there. I don't need to go in and adjust any of the specific colors. I'm just adjusting the master hue, and I brought it all the way to gold. You can see what that does is now in the highlight reflections, it's all balanced. As I move this over, if I go too red, it's noticeable. That's where you've just got to find that nice happy medium where it looks the same as everything else. And there you go. I don't even know what this was. This is very subtle. Tiny adjustments here. Who knows? Maybe I was going crazy. Sometimes these things, you just do it and you don't really pay attention. It's too subtle almost to matter. Just see, subtle adjustment there. Doesn't really do anything. Next up, I've just used another Z depth pass over the top. This time on the vignette, I've darkened the whole image. So let me get rid of this. You can see by making it darker here, it's when I multiply over the top, anytime I go below 1, it's going to darken off. So I set that to multiply. By putting it everywhere though, it doesn't really work. That's why I've just masked off down the bottom. We're getting close, guys. At this point, I would once again go back, look at the image as a whole, and take a break and see what needs to be done. Now in the material creation workflow, you'll be very familiar with creating grunge maps with the triplanar and blending them in composite maps. You can do the exact same thing in post. Obviously, if you've got really complicated geometry, overlaying grunge can not look very realistic because you're not really factoring in the angle or the normal of the geometry. Or if you've got very flat surfaces, you have to do work to align that stuff. Thankfully, on a scene like this, I can incorporate detail like that very easily, and I noticed that the scene was really detailed, but let's be honest, the back wall here is probably the biggest letdown of the whole scene. There was times where I felt like just simply redoing this, but I ran out of time, and at the end of the day, you have to call it quits somewhere. So I just thought maybe I could boost the back wall a little bit more in post, or make it a little bit less obvious by darkening it off. So let me go in here. You can see I've just got a simple grunge map taken from my textures, and I've just put it on multiply, and I've masked that off just by, you know, making a mask from the background itself. Next up, I use that exact same mask to darken off the back wall. Now, when you're making major adjustments, there's usually two main components, just the brightness and the hue and saturation. So the first here, I've dropped it down just to stop and increase the contrast or the gamma correction. Then I've gone in and desaturated it and pushed it a little bit more towards the blue side. I felt like having it a bit red like this was maybe a little bit out of place. Now that I look at it now though, it's a subtle adjustment. You could get away with either or. Maybe I would even leave it as a bit red. Sorry, losing my voice. That's what happens when you record. You know, you got to realize for every time I record, there'll be like an additional, for every minute I record, there'll be 2 to 10 minutes of wasted recording that I've got to redo. So you lose your voice very quickly when a lesson gets 2 hours long. Alright, so let's just say, you know, you can always go in and reevaluate. Let's just say I don't even want to adjust the color. So I can get rid of that. Now we're getting down into the very subtle stuff. Now, if you notice in the flowers here, when I was looking around, everything's really saturated. We've got really saturated oranges, grapes, you know, slime. But the flowers here, you know, they're beautiful, but they're not very saturated. So I went in and made a mask for those, and then just boosted the saturation in places, and just brought out a little bit of color. Let's see here, just makes them a little bit more purple. Now I haven't applied this to everywhere. You know, I didn't want to affect all of the flowers, just the ones connected to the plants. Now looking at all of the glass in the scene, if you remember, I said the hero objects are usually going to be the brightest. Now after doing all of this retouching, the hero objects, you know, you've got to solidify what those are the main water jug, the candle holder, and the grapes. These objects to the left and the right, they're secondary objects. So after the whole process, I thought maybe I should darken those off to make them a little bit less noticeable. And now if I get rid of everything here, really pay attention. Subtle adjustments like this can be the difference. You're always, you know, having composition in the back of your mind at all times. Is this tying in with the composition of the scene? If not, is it because of where the object is placed? Or is it because of how bright the object is? Is it because of the color the object is? But when you have those kind of ideas in your mind and when you're factoring all of that stuff in, simple adjustments can be the difference. So by darkening those off, I'm kind of indenting them into the scene a bit, and it just the way contrast behaves effectively makes these three objects appear brighter. Some simple adjustment now on the rod on the left. I thought this was once again just a bit desaturated. It looks a bit CG. So I just boosted the saturation on that to make it look a little bit more rusty. Maybe I can go even a bit more. But if you go too far, then it becomes really noticeable, you know. So there's a fine line. I notice, I mean, this is what I mean about you can get 2.5, 3 hours into a project and totally not realize there's mistakes in it. That's why it's good to take those breaks and pay attention, because in the beauty render, I'd accidentally applied the leaf material to the stem of one of the plant models, and it doesn't look very good. So I made an alpha for that and went in and adjusted the hue. You can see I pushed that more towards orange, and I've desaturated it, effectively making it look more like a stem color. Then I've gone in, made the same alpha, and darkened it off so it wasn't as noticeable. And we're getting things in tune with some of the rest of the stems in the scene already there. Now I just thought, after everything I did, maybe the candle adjustments were a bit too strong, a little bit too obvious, so I just, you know, went back on those a bit. but it's still slightly different to the background. Then lastly, the gold here just seemed very green. Now, I adjusted this hue multiple times throughout the retouching process. Please don't think that when I've made this hue adjustment, I'm just perfectly happy with it. At every stage of the process, I'm going in, tweaking, increasing the saturation, decreasing, whatever it is. But I finally settled on desaturating it just a little bit and pushing it a little bit away from that solid green and yellow color. You know, I thought it made it look a bit more realistic. And then lastly, I just adjusted the slime again. You know, at this point I was pretty happy. Dimitri was happy. We're both in there at the office looking at it, and we thought it was really good. Even when you're happy, you know, even when you're finished, once again, take a step back, come back to it in an hour or two, because there's always going to be little things that you might want to fix. If you're under a deadline, you don't have that opportunity, fair enough. But if you're doing a personal project and you make a few changes, always take that step back before accepting it as done. You know, spend the 30 minutes away from the computer, whatever it is, come back, look at it with fresh eyes, because that's the difference between just a raw render out of V-Ray that you post and really going in and fine-tuning everything. If I go and post that to Facebook, or if I go post a lesson on that, it's not winning any awards. No one thinks it looks good. Soon as you do the post work, soon as you go in and put that fine-tuning and additional work and effort in, that's when you cross that threshold. You know, that's when it becomes impressive. One of the final things, I put a color lookup over the top here. It's very subtle. It's only sitting at 4%. What this is doing is, let's zoom in and take a look at the blacks in the scene. It's just lifting those a little bit so that they're not perfectly black. You know, when you take a photo, the blacks aren't ever going to be, you know, pure zero black. You know, there's always going to be something there. I think it makes it look a little bit more vintage too. Now, even though I've got this crop marker over the top, if you are happy, just zoom in and really crop it to it so that you're not seeing that kind of get in the way of how you're interpreting the image. So I'll crop in here. This might take a little while. And then I'll just stare at it one last time. Alright guys, this lesson ended up going on longer than I expected, and I'm still doing some work on the material lesson, so I've broken that up into an additional section. I feel like I'm covering a lot of important stuff though in this lesson that's ended up becoming quite a bit bigger than expected. But on top of that, I'm really excited because unlike last time where it took me ages to get back into that recording mindset, this time it only took me 3 to 4 weeks to, you know, recover from the heavy workload from the previous lesson, sit back down at the computer, start scripting some stuff out. I'm still not fast enough. I'm still not happy with the time, but if I change the way the lessons are constructed, make them a little bit more simple, I'm extremely confident I can get back to doing lessons once a month like I did on the V-Ray course. I think that's a really good time frame. It gives me time to relax and rest, and it also gives me time to knuckle down and get stuff out. I've got some help at the moment psychologically from, you know, one of my dad's friends, and I'm gonna kind of keep that on the down low for now, but I'm mentally getting stronger. I'm mentally becoming more motivated due to that help, and I'm really excited for what's to come. So the goal now is to get the next material lesson out in half the time and really finalize that, because that's also seeming to grow and expand. But I'll wrap the lesson up here. Once again, massive thank you to Chaos Group for the additional help I got on this lesson. I want to give a thank you to Ballistic Publishing for the award that this project won. I'm extremely proud that after all of the work I've put into this, I can say that it has done more than I expected, and the personal feedback I've gotten so far from the lessons is really good, and it's lifting my spirits up, and I'm happy to keep going on this stuff. Thanks, guys. I'll see you in the next material lesson.